The third modality we're going to look at is touch. And we here are going to ignore the distinction among the different receptor types. So we're not interested in the difference between thermoception, pain, light touch, vibration, and so on. We're interested in touch conceived of as a way of interacting with the world. And there the entire skin surface is involved. So the entire skin surface is the sensory surface in this case. And the part of the brain to which it projects is known as the primary somatosensory cortex. And on the illustration there, the somatosensory cortex is seen as the purple gyrus that is at the foremost part of the parietal lobe, just behind the frontal lobe. There's an interesting correspondence between the somatosensory cortex, which is the primary sensory cortex for touch, and the primary motor cortex, which lies in the frontal lobe, and we'll examine that in a minute. Now, in some respects, touch is where we should really be honing our intuitions about perception. Vision is a highly specialized mode of perception. Many animals have different kinds of visual systems, and seeing is very, very complex. And different animals have different sensory systems. But touch is fundamental. You cannot be an embodied being and not be in touch with your world. You can be an embodied being without vision. You can be an embodied being without hearing. But to have a body is to be in touch with the world. So historically, an awful lot of the work around perception has been done with concentration on the visual modality. And this work is infested with theological notions of angels and images and nonsense. It's very, very difficult to understand seeing if you start with seeing as your paradigmatic form of perception. But remember, evolution is a very slow process. A highly developed visual system like ours is a latecomer to the scene. And so to get some fundamental intuitions about what's going on in perception, it helps to refocus our attention and to allow touch to inform us about some things we might not have thought about. Now, what are the pathways from the skin to the primary somatosensory cortex? Well, guess what? They're complicated. They're always complicated. First of all, everything goes through the spinal cord, goes up into the central nervous system. There are branches. There's a part of the brain we haven't discussed called the thalamus, buried deep within. Everything coming from the skin goes through the thalamus, among other things. So there's a split. Some go through the thalamus. Most sensory systems, and particularly the visual and the auditory system, also have branches that go through the thalamus. Lord knows what it's doing. But then we arrive at the primary somatosensory cortex. And as we do so, we can follow once more the spatial mapping from the layout of the receptor surface, the skin, to the layout of the primary sensory cortex. So we can follow the mapping. And in this case, we can actually draw a little homunculus shown on the left-hand side there. You can see where the different parts of the body project onto the primary somatosensory cortex. Now, there's a difference here between the manner in which the retina projects to primary visual cortex and the basilar membrane projects to primary auditory cortex. In those two cases, it was possible to project entirely without cutting the surface. That is no longer possible with a complex three-dimensional shape like the outer skin of the body, and so there are a few cuts here, but by and large the mapping is continuous. But there is once more shrinkage and stretching, and that gives rise to that distorted view of the body that you see on the left-hand side on the primary somatosensory cortex. You can see that there's a great deal of cortical area given over to those areas where we're most sensitive, specifically the face, the mouth, the lips, and the hands, and far less given over to things like the knees. The knees are not very sensitive. They don't need a lot of brain area. Now, an interesting structural characteristic of brains that we need to understand lies in the similarity between this organization of the primary somatosensory cortex and the organization of that fold that lies next up in the frontal lobe, which is the primary motor cortex. This is the point from which long nerves descend down to the spinal cord and pass on impulses which will result in voluntary movement of the musculoskeletal system. Now, when we follow those projections, we can also understand a relationship between a brain area and the surface of the skin. And look how similar it looks. We find the same kind of distortions. We find vastly more area given over to the face and the mouth and the hands, much less to the other parts of the body. We can construct these homunculi that are drawn here over one side of the somatosensory cortex and one side of the motor cortex. These are, of course, repeated on the other side of the brain. And what we end up is these two guys. Now, if you like to think of perception as being input, these guys are going to give you a headache. If you met them in a bar, or you met one of them in a bar, and then you went into the lounge and you met the other one, you'd say, I just saw you in there. They are so obviously the same guy, right? I mean, look at him. You wouldn't mistake him for anyone else. So what we see here is a caution against any attempt to understand the sensory capacities as pure input separated from output. Rather, here we see very directly that there's a reciprocal relationship between our sensory embedding in the world and our movement in the world. They operate together. We pointed to this in the case of vision when I said that we see with our legs, because every time I move my body, what I see changes. So that is a reciprocity, but the movement of the body looks very little like the surface of the retina, so it's harder to see the equivalence. And in the case of audition, we can't see this at all. But in the case of movement and touch, we can see that there is a reciprocal relationship such that we are suspended in the world through the good offices of our senses and our capacity to act. So here in touch, we have uncovered something very basic and fundamental about perception. In common with vision and audition, we have a spatial map in which adjoining areas in primary sensory cortex are derived from adjoining areas on the exterior of the body, the retina, the basilar membrane, the skin. And the map is lawfully related to properties of the world. On the retina, it's the spatial layout of optical texture. On the basilar membrane, it's the spatial layout of the frequencies. On the surface of the body, it's the spatial layout of the body. So vision, audition, and touch share something extremely important in their common organization. There's a primary sensory cortex with map-like relations to properties of the world. In all three cases, there's as much going in as there is coming out. This is not a simple input-output system. This is an activity of the body. That's why sense-making, again, is a useful word. In all cases, the pathways are vastly more simple than pipelines. These are not simple pipelines, and they include the mysterious role of the thalamus. And these three modalities are quite different from what we would encounter were we to go and investigate smell and taste, which I would love to do, but we don't have time. Or proprioception, kinesthesia, and interoception. Again, we don't have time. Now, vision, audition, and touch here have been defined not with respect to receptor properties, but with respect to a mode of engagement in the world. So in order to pick out and spot this commonality, we had to frame these as performing specific functions for an organism. That'll be of use as we go on.